So, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree was nominated for Game of the Year. A lot of people had a few different takes on this, and I've sat down and made this video a few different times. The main thing that I came down to was DLC and value proposition. And I want to start with value proposition. When we think about DLC, we think about downloadable content, what we will get, what we will enjoy, the additional add-ons for whatever game. So for some people that may be cosmetics, for other people that may be cosmetics or skins, for other people that may be stages, for other people that may be characters, for other people that may be additional storylines. So when we talk about DLC, excuse me, and we talk about value, these two things are going to be interchangeable. However, value one is derived out of the individual based on what it is they choose to spend their money on. And when I talk about DLC, I want to be clear mainly because DLC ranges in a wide variety of prices depending on games and what kind of games you play. Single player games, it really depends. And Shadow of the Erdtree is a single player DLC based on Elden Ring. So in this situation, they're asking for $40. Now I do want to be clear, $40 is an entire game in and of itself. So that's a high asking price. However, I want to sit down and turn to the other side. We had another AAA game come out, and let's say it's Bethesda Starfield. Their DLC was $30. Now, here is again where I talk about value. Now, for $30, there's a lot of different kind of games you can buy, from physical to digital. Now, in reference to Starfield asking for $30 for its DLC, people who bought the game spent hundreds of dollars on it. And people who got the base game and then bought the DLC all said it was, or most of the people said it was underwhelming. Most of the people said it was cut content. And most people claimed that they cut corners and they felt that it was underwhelming. So when I sit down and I look at value in this situation, the players who bought it did not claim the $30 they spent was valuable. So in reference to a Game of the Year nomination, I think a $40 title is reasonable when you think of the value that it was given to the player despite the fact it was DLC. In both situations, one, in reference to Erdtree, it was well received. Thousands, I say thousands, hundreds of thousands came back into the game when the DLC released. I mean, it's a single player game, so it's not like it's breaking the actual servers or anything, but people are coming back in droves when you think of this mass appeal that sold 20 million copies in a month 2 years ago. So with the fact that they're giving people so much value, and I personally did not buy the DLC, but you could effectively make like 12 different kind of builds. They gave like 40 plus weapons or something like that. And again, when I sit down and talk about DLC and value, if that's something that you don't find valuable, I can understand why you would claim Shadow of the Erdtree does not deserve to be a Game of the Year nomination. But when I look at games, Game of the Year nominations, and really being able to quote-unquote derive value from a game, in reference to what you're spending, right? A free-to-play game, you're not going to derive much value from it because you don't have to invest money into it. And once you invest money into it, then you say, I find value in this to put money into it. But when you have to make a hard purchase up front, a lot of people are not necessarily happy to necessarily what they spend hundreds of dollars on, especially in the gaming landscape when you talk about base editions, premium editions, collector's editions. There's been a lot of slop that's been released, and people's hard-earned money was taken, and they spent hundreds of dollars on unfinished products. Battlefield 2042, Redfall. Honestly, I can really pick out a laundry list of games, Cyberpunk 2077, and I'm mainly referring to these games on launch. But the point is, Some of these games never recovered, and some of them did. However, Shadow of the Erdtree and Elden Ring as a whole stood tall from the moment it was released, honestly, to the DLC. Did it release in a perfect state? No, most games don't release in a perfect state. They all have some kind of technical flaw or issue. However, when I'm looking at value and I'm looking at if I were to buy DLC, would I spend my $40 on this and be satisfied? Personally, as someone who buys fighting games, I know when I buy a fighting game, there's going to be a DLC. How many DLC will there be? I have no idea. However, if I want all the DLC, typically if it's a bigger budget or bigger company made game, depending on how well it does, it'll likely have 2 passes. For instance, with Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, this is a game that's likely going to have 2+ season passes. Dragon Ball Fighters only really had 2. However, it doesn't really look like that was a game they were looking to support long term based on the games that we received after the fact. But the point is, this is a certain medium of game where I know what to expect when I buy a fighting game. In reference to like a single player game that not necessarily had the same amount of content, but is still a single player game that was well received, is Nier Automata. I personally never bought the End of Yorha edition, but a lot of people praised the game. Did it get Game of the Year? I'm not sure. However, would people want that DLC, which was $10, to be a Game of the Year nomination? Not necessarily. And were people asking for that? No, not to what I'm seeing. However, I'm seeing it sells very well to be ported to various systems. But that doesn't change one thing. Players showed up for Shadow of the Erdtree as DLC. And in most games, in most cases, they do not. And in most cases, they don't stay unless it's good. So when I stop and I look at spending money for DLC and then the value proposition of whether I would consider something like this or any DLC, excuse me, consider something like this or any DLC Game of the Year worthy, I would rather sit down and be honest with myself and say, if I didn't play it, I can't necessarily claim it's Game of the Year. But if I'm looking at it from a value perspective, I can make a better decision. In reference to some of the examples that I gave, Starfield Shattered Space, a $30 DLC that players didn't show up for. A lot of people claimed it was cut content. A lot of people felt it was underwhelming. People didn't show up for that. Is that something they claimed would be Game of the Year? Yet it was backed by a multi-billion-dollar company. They were acquired by Microsoft. So, no. From Software is not, at least owned to my knowledge, by a multi-billion-dollar company. Maybe their parent company is worth like $2 billion. Complete guess. But they are not pushing the very same games that majority of the, I would say, studios around the globe are. So when I look at spending $40 for any DLC, yeah, I'm looking at what am I getting for this? I can tell you plenty of times in reference to the fighting game DLCs that I purchased, no fighting game DLC should be nominated for Game of the Year, because that doesn't make sense. However, when I'm talking about value, it didn't give me the value that I felt was worth that $35 or $40 that I spent at that time for that DLC. I'm mainly referring to Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 for reference. I don't remember the original price it released at. But when I look at spending $40 to effectively get another game on top of a game, why would that not make sense to me to have Shadow of the Erdtree nominated for Game of the Year? And something came to my mind as I was saying this. In reference to Nintendo, they were talking about how they were creating DLC for the original Breath of the Wild. They said that it got so big it became another game. Could they have sat down and made you something cheap that was a quick cash grab? No, but could they have made you a DLC that you would have wanted and it would have been acceptable? Sure. But instead they gave you another game, and that game was, I'm not sure if that game was nominated. I'm not sure if Tears of the Kingdom was nominated for Game of the Year. I'd have to do my research. But I don't believe so. But it's one of those examples where they gave you an entire game based off of what they already gave you from the beginning. In this case, From Software was able to build on top of Elden Ring. In Nintendo's case, they weren't. They just gave you another game entirely. But in both cases, they still gave you another game entirely. Only one you can have as a completely separate game on a completely different cartridge that has more story elements that are flushed out, I guess. And the other is built upon the story that's already given. Same thing, but in two different packages, you could say. But I would look at it as this. Shadow of the Erdtree being nominated for Game of the Year, when I stop and I look at the value proposition and I look at the DLCs that I can compare in not only its own medium, but in other mediums, I believe that, yeah, the $40 asking price makes sense when players are really showing up for the game. And most importantly, when it comes to the people who are running the awards, they're saying the players are the ones making the choices. If I were to begin by naming the nominees for the Game of the Year awards for 2024, Metaphor ReFantazio, Baltaro, Astrobot, Black Myth Wukong, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and then, of course, the topic of today's conversation, Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. As I've discussed earlier, when we talk about DLC and we talk about value, I believe when we talk about the Game Awards, this does give not only the Game Awards value, but it gives us, the people, a bit of value. I believe Shadow of the Erdtree is truly a genre-defying, not even an industry-defying piece of media where now the award shows have to create an entirely new category to me after this. Not necessarily because Shadow of the Erdtree is not deserving of the Game of the Year nomination, but because players showed up and stated to the I would say top brass in this case that this game is worthy, or this DLC is worthy of a nomination, that a new category entirely could be DLC of the year. Why not? It doesn't mean that DLC can't transition over, which Elden Ring has already showed it can. I believe it gives us much more to talk about and a bit more to comparison. To give us a bit more to compare. And this is the entire point of today's video about value in DLC. I believe Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree has defied everybody's expectation of what DLC value really means. I heard another creator, the Black Hokage, talk about this, and he was saying that he feels Elden Ring will make people look at their DLC purchases differently. And I have to agree, simply because as someone, again, who buys fighting game DLC and things like that, now I look at single player narrative DLC. Are you going to sit down and make me pay $10 for something you can give me for free? Like, it doesn't really make sense. Like, God of War did something like that, where they gave you the DLC for free. Could they have charged you $10? Sure. But in reference to a single player game charging a full $70, when it came out, it charged a full $60. Elden Ring likely is not $70 most days, most times this year, right? But in reference to a full price game offering effectively a middle tier game price for DLC. It only makes sense now that we can sit down and compare the value someone would get for the DLC that they're paying in reference to a single player title based on the price. And for people to stop and want to evaluate this only makes sense. And I believe this is a great conversation that opens people up to saying, hey, yeah, Shattered Space was not worth $30, despite the fact that that's what Bethesda wants to charge you for it. Does it mean you can't get it cheaper later? Not necessarily. But even then, would people still say that price tag is worth it? I believe Shadow of the Erdtree being even cheaper than $40 is worth it for me personally. But that's the thing. Everybody has their own value in their own way, but Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree has defied people's value expectations. And I believe that is not only something to be looked at, but to be praised and acknowledged. And most importantly, opens up the conversation. So, should there now be a new category in reference to the Game of the Year awards for DLC of the Year? You tell me. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.